Every place has its challenges.
How different it is like living in a big city like Dubai versus maybe Toronto.
It's expensive to eat out. Taxes, that's one place where UAE is very good. But in Canada, you get taxed on everything.
How is your general perception of living in Canada?
It's a lot. And I think, but I would say living in Canada, I feel extremely privileged. I feel very lucky. It's expensive, you know.
Okay.
Cost of living, especially the last 10 years, has gone up quite a bit.
Just generally from your perspective, do you find it different here, the diversity in UAE versus the diversity in Canada?
I think on its surface,
Whether you've ever faced any kind of racism where you felt like it was a little tricky to express?
absolutely.
Is it better to live in Canada or the UAE as an expat? That's what we talked about in this episode. I'm a Pakistani born and raised in the UAE. I had Mo Amir on the show, who is a Canadian Pakistani who's raised in Canada and lived in UAE for around 4 years. We compared our countries, our experiences living in these countries. We talked about what is better and what is worse in which country, healthcare, infrastructure, quality of life, income level, cost of living, taxation, all of that. So there's a lot of interesting perspectives that we shared in this episode. I hope you enjoy it. And let me know in the comments what you prefer, Canada or the UAE.
My name is Mo Amir, and I'm the host and creator of a TV talk show in Canada, specifically in Vancouver, British Columbia, called This is Vancolour. So very honored to be here. I know you've built quite the vibrant community through your work and content, so it means a lot to me that you would invite me to be here. In terms of my background, I was born in Karachi, Pakistan as well, but like many Pakistani expats, I guess, if you would call them that. My dad was already working in Dubai. So from age 0 to 4, I lived in Dubai. Obviously don't have a ton of recollection. I remember sort of our apartment from the inside a little bit. And then from age 4 onwards, basically lived in Vancouver, Canada.
Already.
So, you know, again, I can speak to the Canadian experience. And there's only things that I've heard about Dubai. So I'm sure that I'll learn a lot today as well, speaking to you.
Awesome. And thank you for being here. It's an honor to have you here. You have an incredible show back in Canada.
Thank you.
I've literally stalked and learned a lot about things that I never knew about. So yeah, thank you very much for coming here. So one thing you mentioned was, you said if it's called Pakistani expats here, why the question though? Like what was the confusion, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think in talking to you and maybe talking to other people that live in the UAE or Dubai, I'm not sure, do you guys see yourself as expats or immigrants? How do you see yourself, I guess?
Okay.
I don't know. Like, I'm just asking. So
I mean, the term that people use in the UAE is expat.
Yeah.
And I guess the term that's usually used in US or Canada, it's immigrant. But why did you kind of make that distinction between expat or immigrant? Do you see there being a difference between the two?
To a certain degree, yes. I mean, I think that the term immigrant implies that there's a pathway to citizenship.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I think that certainly when people migrate to North America, whether it's the US or Canada, they call themselves immigrants as opposed to expats.
Yeah.
Whereas here, when people migrate from South Asia to the UAE, they seem to call themselves expats. So that's why I'm making the distinction. But even myself, I'm not exactly entirely sure what delineates what.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm not entirely sure if there's like a strict difference between the two, because technically I guess they could be used like synonymously. But I do know that in the UAE, we almost never use the word immigrant.
I think with Canada, there's a slight difference where one of the Canadian national values is multiculturalism. And so being able to keep sort of your ancestral or home country identity is very important in Canada, and I think people feel very free to express that.
Okay.
So the embrace of multiculturalism in Canada, I would say, is different than the United States. But in Canada, it is very much encouraged to, I think, hold that ancestral background that you have diaspora communities, whether it's, European or Asian or whatever else, and celebrate that as kind of let's call it a joint custody of identity.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's beautiful. I'm trying to understand how do people in Canada generally consider their identity? Like, how would they define it? So, for instance, would you consider yourself Canadian first? Is that like the primary identity you would see yourself as
I think
having?
in terms of nationality, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Because I don't have a Pakistani passport. I don't have and this is me as well because I from age 4 onwards lived in
Yes.
Canada. So I don't know anything else aside from Canada in terms of a home
Home.
country.
Yeah.
So for me, absolutely Canadian. I think even my dad, who has lived technically majority of his life in Canada, would
Okay.
probably see it that way as well.
Okay.
There may be some, obviously some ties to Pakistan, but generally speaking, I think when you come to Canada, you immigrate and you become a permanent resident and then a citizen, you do see your nationality as Canadian.
Canadian.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do
But
think it becomes primary for sure.
do you think that's especially because they get citizenship, or is that generally because, I guess, the culture there, because of how you integrate there? Yeah, how do you see the relationship
It's
of?
probably both. I mean, I think
Yeah.
the citizenship in some regards becomes very symbolic, right? Because if you are living in a place and you are availing the public services that they have, if you're paying taxes into the society as well, you do see yourself as part of it, and you obviously develop certain roots there the longer you are in a country. So I think the identity with being Canadian evolves over time the more you live there, and certainly the more generations of a family lives there. And I think what I would also say is it is very much reciprocated. I think Canadian culture, for the most part, do see immigrants when they arrive and they create a life as Canadian as well. There's no real distinction. If anything, maybe there's interest of family backgrounds or how you got to Canada or how your family got to Canada. But generally speaking, I think Canadian culture is quite accepting of, who is a Canadian. It's not that you have to look a certain way or talk a certain way. And we see that expressed in many different aspects of life. I know, you might know that ice hockey is a very popular sport in Canada, but we also have ice hockey broadcasts, so the same league, NHL, being broadcast in Punjabi in Canada because there's a
Oh,
big
wow.
Punjabi fan base, and so they have commentators that speak Punjabi and
Oh, that's
comment
quite
and
nice.
give the play-by-play in Punjabi.
I always say that home is so dependent on the people that you surround yourself with. So if you're in Canada, or if you're in the US, or if you're in Mexico or in the UAE, but you have people there that you genuinely enjoy being around, you have a community there.
I think especially when you're young and you live in a place through your formative years where you create certain friendships, and obviously, I think the ages 0 to, I would even say up to 25, really do shape who you become as an adult. And so when you live those years in a certain place, you feel kinship to that place. And
Yeah.
so school is one of those big ones because that's when you start creating communities. That's where you start finding your interests in life.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I think that's why a lot of people in the UAE who've lived here as expats, even if they don't have the citizenship, they still have that irreplaceable connection to the
Totally.
country.
And I think, there can also be a difference of people who, whether it's Canada or the UAE, go to a new country with a very specific objective. So let's say you are going there just for 4 years of university. You might view that place differently and not as home. Maybe it will develop. I don't know. If you go there strictly for, a business contract or for a job, maybe you don't see that place as home. But certainly, as I just said, when you're younger and you grew up in a place, like you don't really know anything else. So
Yeah.
what else would be home?
Yeah, that makes total sense. But yeah, that's interesting that you said that it also depends on the goal that you have when
Yeah.
you go into a country. I was reading about how this is UAE perspective. I'm not sure how it is in Canada, but I was reading about how UAE has the lowest net immigration rate in the world. So a lot of people who end up moving here, if they plan to stay for 4 years, 5 years, they end up staying much longer.
Let's say you get married, you have a family. Your kids, what citizenship is conferred onto them?
So the one that you have, so if I'm Pakistani, my kids would be Pakistani.
Automatically.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So of course, like in that case, it's
Because we have like birthright citizenship in
Canada.
right? So even if your parents are not citizens, but if you're born in the country, you would become you would become Canadian.
But I think in the I know in the US recently they wanted to evoke that, like they changed it.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the status of that is in the United States, but they did have at least for a long time had birthright citizenship. So.
And it's still there in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. How do you feel about that though? Like this difference in, I guess, the countries. It's just like your general perspective on this, or your general feeling about this difference.
I mean, I think it has its drawbacks, and like any system, there's going to be people that I think maybe misuse the system or exploit it. So in Canada, even, we've also had this problem of they call it birther tourism, where people come just to have their kid, and so they get the citizenship conferred.
What is it called?
Like I'm not sure if this is the proper term, but like birther tourism.
Okay.
So yeah, you would just want to have your kid there in order to get access to citizenship, right? You know, is that a different case than someone who has been a permanent resident for a few years and then they had a kid there? I think so.
Yeah.
But who am I to say? I don't know. But in terms of that, the whole system of birthright citizenship, I mean, I think it makes sense in a land of settlers, right? Like Canada is, and the United States is very much a land of immigrants. This is one of those pathways that makes it easier and encourages people not only to come settle and have a life, but also not worry about, you know, the legal standing of their children if they were to have them in Canada. So I think it encourages people to build, it's at least in theory, it's supposed to encourage people to build a life in Canada. Yeah. The idea is never that you get your citizenship and go leave somewhere else. Yeah. The idea is that you stay and live and work and contribute to your community.
So to kind of circle back to what we were initially talking about, which is just living, how is it like living in Canada, right? I'm not sure if I asked you that to start off. I didn't ask you, like, just generally, if you had to talk about how is your general perception of living in Canada? How is it like living in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, every place has its challenges and varying degrees of challenges. But I would say living in Canada, I feel extremely privileged. I feel very lucky. I think it is one of the best places to live in the world on many different metrics, right? I do think that there is certainly a certain amount of freedom that is conveyed in Canada. And that includes just the acceptance and tolerance of most Canadians as well, in terms of being able to, you know, freely live your truth or practice your religion. You know, so that I think is something that I don't take for granted, especially as I get older. I think where I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, it's just such a beautiful part of the world as well in terms of natural beauty. Something where when you grow up, you don't really think about it, but then as you see the world, you realize like, oh, we're very lucky to have oceans and mountains and, you know, rainforest essentially. And so I consider myself very lucky. It also is, you know, on a relative scale, one of the safest places in the world. It's not like Dubai. Dubai is maybe the safest place in the world, where you can leave a designer bag somewhere and no one's going to steal it, or no one's going to take it, I guess. But Canada still, relatively speaking, is pretty safe. I do think that Canadian people are also very kind and nice. You know, again, every place has their issues, but overall, I think Canadians are very nice and neighborly, and like it's hard to contrast it with anywhere else in the world when you haven't lived in those places.
Makes sense.
But overall, I just feel like based on everything that the country has given me in terms of opportunities, I think it's one of the best places in the world, if not the no, it is the best. I'm just going to say
wow, okay.
I'm just going to say it's the best. Listen, I'm a proud Canadian. It's the best. Canadians are very modest too, to our own detriment. So I'm just going to say, it's the best place in the world to live.
Canada is the best place in the world to live.
Yeah.
Okay, so I
say that as a non-expert of other places, but as a Canadian, it is the best place.
I mean, obviously for me, when I've lived in UAE all my life, I always say UAE is the best place in the world to live. So I understand. You
got to represent the home team.
Yeah, literally, I understand. I love how you like changed your You didn't change it, but you were like very reserved, and then you were like, okay, Canada's the best place in the world.
And that's like peak Canadian too.
What is something you don't like about Canada then?
During the winter, when I have to shovel my driveway for the 5th time in a month, then I start to get a little tired. And Vancouver's not that bad. We don't get that much snow. So 5 times in a month is actually pretty rare.
Okay.
It's usually like a big snowstorm for a few days that you end up shoveling your driveway a bit. So sometimes the cold can be a bit much. Yeah. What else do I not like about Canada? I mean,
I can tell that's a hard question.
It's expensive,
Okay.
Cost of living, especially the last 10 years, has gone up quite a bit. It feels like, and I don't know if this is the entire world, but I feel like certainly in Canada, it feels like you're paying more and getting less in almost every aspect of your life.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it's got its issues that way in terms of, and people struggle with it, right? Like, I don't want to make light of it. I do think that when it comes to cost of living, there are some Canadians that absolutely do struggle with. We have record lineups at our local food banks, which is basically where people go to get donations of food because they can't afford it. So there are a lot of challenges with Canada, which obviously I don't like that's happening. I think some of those challenges we see in other Western countries as well.
I want to touch a little bit upon whether you've ever faced any kind of racism where you felt like it was a little tricky to express a different side of your identity. Or maybe not you, or you've seen racism, racist encounters. How often does that happen? Or
yeah, I think it's an unfortunate reality that racism exists throughout the world. Canada is not unique in terms of having racism. I don't think racism necessarily rears its head when your culture is being expressed. Because I think racists are just going to be racist regardless. So as Canadian as I am, or as assimilated, or whatever you want to say as I am, absolutely, I've faced it, as have, I would say, all people of color in Canada at some point. There's also varying forms of racism, right? So there's the very explicit form of racism of, being harassed by a stranger because you are of a certain ethnicity or a certain religion, let's say. We all kind of understand that form. And that unfortunately does happen. I think it's very limited, but it does happen.
Okay.
The more sort of subversive racism we see, we can call it systemic racism or whatever, is where there just seems to be a discrepancy in terms of the equity of opportunities and what opportunities are available to who. And it's a problem that exists. We know, they've literally done government reports where Indigenous people of Canada are treated differently in the healthcare system than non-Indigenous people.
Oh, okay.
They've done studies where if your resumes are the same, but you have an Anglo-sounding name, your resume gets preferred. They've done blind tests on this as well. So these things absolutely exist. And I think there's a certain consciousness, and maybe you won't like this word, but there's a certain wokeness about these things existing. And I think that's a good thing because it's never perfect, but I think there is definitely a segment of society that understands this.
I don't think I've thought about it enough when it comes to the UAE, which I probably should. But one thing that when I think about the UAE and how they treat people of who have disabilities, we don't even call it people with disabilities. There's a special term to it in the UAE. They call it people of determination. So that's like the official term that's used in the law everywhere. It's called people of determination. And, there are special parkings. There are special in the trains and metros. There are special places, which is probably the same in Canada. In those aspects, UA has done a lot. There's even walkways that are specifically dedicated for people of determination. I think there's even beaches that makes it easier for people of determination to go through. So they've done quite a lot. There are a lot of facilities for people of determination. But I think the one thing that I find very interesting is the way people in the UAE just change their terminology of certain words, like disabled people. Like they've completely, I don't think I've ever used the word disabled people here because it's so natural for us to say people of determination. So that's kind of...
It could be a semantics thing. I mean, a lot of these labels, I think they should come from the communities themselves. So certainly in Canada, I think people with disabilities, that's how they refer to themselves as, right? And there's actually been a rejection of the framing special needs because that's not a term that came from that community.
Yeah, makes sense. I always find it interesting how people in the UAE versus people in US, Canada, or in the West, I guess they have a different definition of freedom.
So there's two, from what I've learned, there's really two types of freedom, right? Okay. So the first type is the freedom to, right? So the freedom to worship in whichever way you'd like, the freedom to, love or marry whoever you want to, the freedom to pursue any type of career you want, the freedom to associate with whoever you'd like. So that's some of those positive freedoms that we think about. But then I think there's also this idea of freedom from. And so, the freedom from hunger, the freedom from poverty, the freedom from homelessness. That is a lot harder, right? But I think Canada certainly has developed a social safety net and continues to try to build a better social safety net to ensure that some of those issues, people are free from those things, or including, things like healthcare, right? Having access to healthcare. So the freedom from, going bankrupt because you can't afford your bills or you can't afford your healthcare bills. So that's how I see these two branches of freedom. One is like this more active type of thing that you're allowed to, that you yourself are doing. And then one is kind of this protective idea of, being shielded from some of these things that do exist in society. So that's kind of how I see freedom, in terms of how it's expressed. And again, I think the overall, though, theme of freedom is that no one is above the law. The law applies equally to everyone, and the law is not arbitrary. So you can't, you can't unknowingly break the law because someone says so. Everyone kind of knows what the rules are.
It's the same for everyone.
Yeah, and you have a judicial system that works with, again, the rule of law and being able to navigate that. So I think overall that's how I see freedom. I think that's a lot of how people in the West might see freedom. But certainly culturally there's different interpretations of what that means as well. So I'd love to hear your take if it's different than what I've described.
I've always considered freedom as safety. And so when you
that's a freedom from, right?
From, yeah,
for sure.
So that's why I was thinking about whether it's only from, because it is definitely freedom from, because that safety is created by the laws, by the protection that the government has instilled in society. That's 100% true. But I feel like freedom to stems from freedom from. Why? Because I feel like I can actively do the things that I want to do because there's that safety net created from the from, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, I think they are obviously related.
I've always seen freedom in, I guess, the UAE, which I just mentioned, as safety, as cleanliness, hygiene,
very
good
clean,
infrastructure,
very safe.
Things like that. Because I feel like that gives me access to do whatever I want.
I've always been of the belief that the government's job is to do its best to meet people's material needs.
And do you think Canada does that well?
Yeah. I mean, yes, it's been a challenge over the last 10 years. Like, objectively speaking, there's certainly certainly, again, things like housing have been very challenging. Healthcare, even though we have universal healthcare, which is free for all Canadians, the access to that healthcare becomes very challenging when you have long wait lists and long waiting times and people don't have access to a family doctor. So again, I think the spirit of that exists, but in practice, it feels like things have been getting worse.
Yeah, I think what you just mentioned about generally the government's responsibility is to meet people's material needs. I think that's quite spot on. I feel like whether you're in UAE, East, West, whatever, you would resonate with that. And I guess I am of the belief that if I'm in a country that is meeting my material needs, and this includes like physical needs like physical safety and needs like food, water, housing, all of that. If the country is able to meet those basic requirements, even if there may be laws that I don't necessarily agree with, I'm okay with living in that country. I feel like that's...
For sure, yeah. And everyone's going to be different, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has a different circumstance of what they prefer.
I kind of want to make a distinction between how multiculturalism is like in Canada versus the UAE, like how different it is. I think... So you were mentioning that in Canada you feel like both of your cultures, your home countries and your host country's culture is well mixed in society, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess how I would put it is, there is an encouragement to celebrate and value your ancestral culture. Right? So it's not just you come here, you're Canadian, now you're only Canadian, which can be, from what I understand of the melting pot of the United States, can be the American attitude of like, you come here, you're an American, now you're an American. Whereas I think with Canada, there is encouragement for people to continue to value their ancestral roots.
Just generally from your perspective of what you've seen and experienced, do you find it different here, the way the diversity in UAE versus the diversity in Canada?
I think on its surface, not really. Like here, there's a lot of different cultures.
Yeah.
And actually it's hard to determine what is the dominant ethnicity in UAE. At least in Canada, you can say, the dominant ethnicity is still, some European heritage.
Okay.
Whereas in the UAE, there's so many cultures, South Asian, Filipino, Eastern European, Chinese. So what is the dominant? Like, I'm just saying, if you're a stranger and you just walked into Dubai one day and you were to say, okay, what's the dominant ethnicity? I think it would be actually very hard to determine what it is. And so I think that's a beautiful thing that you have so many different cultures in one place. Certainly you see that expressed in terms of the diaspora communities that are here, whether it's the restaurants and the cuisine or the other cultural events that Dubai hosts as well. So Dubai feels like an international city. Dubai particularly, it's the only real place I've been to in the UAE. I've been to Abu Dhabi here and there, but Dubai feels like an international city. Whereas I think Canada certainly has, obviously it has indigenous roots in terms of the indigenous people that have lived there for thousands of years. But Canada as a state or as a colonial settler state, whatever you want to call it, has European roots. And I think that feeling still very much exists of like its identity with an openness to understanding that other ethnicities from around the world are also equally Canadian.
Okay, interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, statistically, 60% of people here are South Asian. So the dominant is South Asian. Number one is Indians.
Yeah.
And now a lot of people say that when they come to the UAE, they feel like they've come to India because they see a lot of Indians here and they learn a lot. Like there are all these videos and jokes about how instead of learning Arabic, when you leave the UAE, you learn words like acha, bhai, and all the Urdu Indian words. Even though both the countries are quite multicultural, they're quite diverse. We've agreed on that. We can't deny that. That's definitely true. I guess the overall connection to your country would just be different in UAE versus Canada. If you think about a Canadian, is there something particular that you would think about when it comes to the way they act? For instance, there's this stereotype, I guess, of the fact that Canadians are nicer, kinder, for instance. The reason why I asked was because I wanted to compare it with the UAE culture, and it's very hard for me to identify what it means to have a UAE culture or to be influenced by UAE culture growing up.
Well, you were telling me that you people in Dubai consume a lot of Turkish cultural products, right? And I'm sure they consume a lot of Indian cultural products, whether it's Bollywood or whatever else. So, I mean, you would be more of an expert in terms of how to define UAE or Dubai culture. One thing I feel silly that I've neglected. French Canadians are also a big part of Canada, a big part of our identity. So our bilingualism becomes a very important part of Canada, is that our two national languages are English and French. You know, when we talk about Canadian identity, and I'm glad I remembered this, but I feel silly that I didn't say it before, the bilingualism portion becomes very important to Canada as well. And it's actually one thing that the Canadian government continues to promote and protect is, you know, the French part of our identity.
Interesting. Yeah, I feel like that when I say culture, a lot of the culture is still impacted by, for instance, colonialism, right? There were the French, there were the British, the European. That kind of Eurocentric idea is still present in the culture. And when I talk about UAE culture, and obviously the birth of UAE is very different, but just generally when I talk about UAE culture, it's very hard for me to kind of pinpoint one thing that determines UAE culture, because there's no such thing as UAE culture. There's Indian culture, there's Emirati culture, there's Pakistani culture, and all of us are just living here in the UAE. I don't think I can picture UAE culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Would you say Canada is more, I don't know what the right term would be in terms of, would I say equitable, or would I say
equitable? Yeah.
Than the US, as in, I don't know what the right term would be. The fact that they are acknowledging their past and they are trying to make it right for the indigenous people. I don't know what term that would be.
I think there's a strong argument that Canada is more equitable on certain metrics, for sure. You even look at something like maternity leave as legislated by law. Canada has much more favorable maternity leave, whereas I think some states it's like 2 weeks or almost non-existent.
And how much is it in Canada?
I believe, I've never gone through it myself. I believe it's it's at least a year, but I think it's a year and a half.
Wow.
You have to fact check me.
Okay, yeah.
But I mean, there's legislated laws about things like maternity leave. Arguably, even access to healthcare or universal healthcare is an equitable measure, right? Because there's no discrimination based on your income level or what class or how much wealth you have. And so I would say that to a certain degree, equity and that pursuit of equity is very much a Canadian value as well, and something that a lot of people take great pride in.
When I asked you about how is Canada doing that, is it doing well? One thing you mentioned was that over the past 10 years, it's been reducing, like deteriorating in a way.
It feels like that, for sure.
It feels like that. Okay. Why do you say that? Why do you think it is deteriorating? In what aspect do you feel that?
I think the central to this is housing,
Oh,
particularly
you
in
said
places
housing.
like Vancouver and Toronto, but in other regions of Canada as well, where housing has just become very expensive. Vancouver is one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, and as much as I love Vancouver and as much as desirable of a place as it is, it's not the economic hub of a London or a New York. So when our land values are comparable to those places, there's something wrong. So housing is a big one. I think, as I also mentioned, healthcare has increasingly become a big one. coast to coast, right? Again, just access to medical specialists, access to family doctors. As much as it's free, we just don't have the human capital to take care of people's needs. And so we need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need more specialists. And so that service, public service, has also felt like it's deteriorated quite a bit in Canada.
I was looking into how, I guess, expats particularly feel about living in Canada versus living in the UAE.
Oh, okay.
And this is a very...
Do you have stats?
Yeah, I have stats
Polling
on
data,
this.
okay.
Not stats, but like rankings. So
Okay.
this is based off of... this is a survey that's a very popular survey. It's called Internation Survey. They do it every year.
Okay.
And they do a survey. They interview... lots of different expats from around the world participate in this survey. And then they kind of describe how they feel about the healthcare, for finances, housing, cost of living, all of that in each of these countries.
Okay, I'm
And-
interested to see the
yeah.
Canadian review.
Okay. So this is kind of a ranking of where there were. So this is for 2024. So it's
Okay.
last year. UAE ranked the 10th best country to work and live in.
Wow.
So this is based off of like expat essentials. Like, does the country have basic necessities for expats? For expat essentials, it actually ranked number 1. And then personal finance and housing and all of that I just mentioned. Canada ranked... actually, unfortunately, Canada was in the bottom 10 of the list. It ranked 49.
49?
Yeah. And
Oh.
but the interesting thing why I brought this up
Yeah.
was because it moved down from 27 to 49 in a year. And that was surprising to me because, okay, even if it's 49 or 27, I think that decline was what I was surprised about. And that kind of linked back to what you just said about how in the past 10 years, it kind of feels like these things are deteriorating or declining when it comes to maybe housing or healthcare or accommodation or things like that. First off, right off the bat, how do you feel about this?
Terrible. No, that's not good. And I'd be curious to know, just out of my own curiosity, like how that survey was conducted. Not because I dispute the results, but in Canada, we've had this issue with international students, and a lot of them do come from South Asian countries. And what's happened is we've had this proliferation of different quote unquote schools, although some would argue they're like degree mills, they're not like proper schools, that bring these kids over largely from India, say, oh, we'll give you a Canadian degree and you can, then you can work here and whatever. And those expectations are just not being met. The education is not great. The housing is very difficult to find for a lot of these students, and the cost of living is very high. And the wages are just not being able, even if they'd work part-time or full-time, the wages just don't keep up with that. I think for a lot of new immigrants, the feeling is probably the same in terms of what you get in terms like your average wages versus the cost of living and the cost of housing primarily. And so those newer waves would have it much more difficult than, 20 years ago.
Interesting.
And so if you were to maybe compare the results of people who had immigrated 20 years ago to today, is there that decline? Absolutely. I mean, you brought up the timeline of a year, which I find that drop quite shocking as well. But that speaks to what I was saying of it's a lot harder now as an immigrant to Canada than it was before.
But I mean, again, this is a survey done, so this is not obviously like stats on what is the income level, what is not. It's not that. It's just what do people feel about living in these countries. So this is like subjective opinions of these participants. Yeah.
And it's absolutely subjective, and then also circumstantial, right? So it might be kind of this normal baseline or average baseline, but that satisfaction level might change if you suddenly had a health episode and needed to go to the hospital. And they'll say, oh yeah, the healthcare is not the same. You pay way more out of pocket. And so are you really, is it comparable in terms of your cost of living or living situation? So a lot of these things do become very circumstantial, right? So now we can kind of get into healthcare a little bit. Sure.
I think my question is just, does free healthcare mean good healthcare? Because I definitely know that there's a universal healthcare system in Canada, which is amazing. In UAE, we don't have a free healthcare system. We pay for insurance. It's quite expensive. We pay, it depends from family to family, but it is expensive. But does that necessarily mean that it's good healthcare? And this is purely based off of like the videos that I've seen when I was doing my research. And what I just saw was most people complaining about the wait times in Canada. But when we talk about money in UAE, it is expensive. That's a fact. But I'm just talking about the quality of the healthcare. And I'm not saying UAE is better. I'm just trying to understand how it is in Canada. And the average wait time was 30 weeks for you to get an appointment. And in UAE, the way it usually is, you can get it on the same day or the next day. So for me, that was surprising. But from your experience living in Canada, how is that? How do you think the quality of healthcare is like?
Oh, yeah, it has its challenges. You're right. I alluded to this before, that the wait times are huge. There's a lot of Canadians that don't even have a family doctor or GP, right? Just because of the lack of family doctors. And then when you have a family doctor, and let's say you have something that needs a test or needs a medical specialist, the wait time for medical specialists is quite long.
Is much longer, yeah.
In terms of this idea of does free healthcare mean good healthcare, I think it's possible. I don't think it's like this impossibility that you can have a universal healthcare system that also functions well, because Canada had that for the longest time. And of course, even back then, it had its challenges like any system does. And so I don't, I don't think that the outcomes that we're seeing now are inevitable. I think the system has to be reformed. There has to be a lot more money put into the actual frontline workers, because that's really where the capacity issues are. The capacity issues are not because we don't have enough buildings. The capacity issue is we don't have enough nurses and professionals working in the field. Like, again, I'm not here to compare which system is best or not, but in terms of the idea of having a universal healthcare system that is fully functional, I think is very much possible. And I think Canadians, to their detriment, get too focused on the Canadian system versus the American system without realizing that there are many systems around the world, including in Europe, that offer different types of models that are still universal. Because there's the worry that then we'll have two-tiered healthcare, one healthcare for the rich and one for the poor. And I don't, I wish we had a greater capacity to at least discuss different models, recognizing like, we're not going to do the American model, but like there's some other, particularly in Scandinavia, there's some interesting models that I think are worth exploring for Canada.
And it's free healthcare there, and I believe the quality is quite good there.
Yeah. And they also went through similar issues where suddenly they had a universal healthcare system which needed reform. It took like 10 years to be able to get to the system that they're at now. And that's something that I think Canadians have to start being a little more open towards. But we also have to be honest and recognize that not all healthcare is free in Canada. Dental, largely, people are still paying out of pocket. They are reforming that to create universal healthcare or universal dental care. Pharmacare for the longest time, same thing. Certain aspects of healthcare you still pay for. So it's not like complete, and it's not like everything is free.
It's free.
Yeah. It's just basically the basics are covered.
I'm curious to know, and I mean, maybe this is too technical, but I'm curious to know how the quality of healthcare is like in the industries that you pay for. So for instance, how would the wait time look like there? Is there a shortage of doctors? That's too technical, but I would be curious.
It's easier to get a dentist than a family doctor.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah.
But the reality is you don't need to see your dentist as often as you would a family doctor, right?
So then it should be easier to have a family doctor to see your family.
I know.
But yeah,
it's attracting
I'm not
the right people.
Yeah. That makes total sense. And I think the point you brought about the Scandinavian countries is very interesting. I think I didn't even consider that because I didn't realize that there is a model that exists in the world where there is free healthcare and the quality is good. This is kind of like a new segment in the podcast. I've never done this before.
Okay.
But it's kind of like a guessing game in a way, where I just wanted you to guess, what do you think are the top 4 countries in the world with the biggest Indian populations? And again, this is like just a guess kind of
Canada
thing.
is like 7th, I think. So we're not like in the top.
I mean, in my list, Canada's there.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
What did I have? I have Canada has the 7th largest Indian diaspora.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know, but the study that I saw
Okay.
a couple of studies I saw showed Canada as 4th or 5th, like
Okay.
in the
So
list.
maybe it depends on the year. I don't know.
Yeah, it could depend on the year, definitely.
But I know that there are about, roughly speaking, 2.5 million South Asian Canadians, and like 35 to 40% are Punjabi.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. That's quite significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is a pretty big diaspora, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So Canada, in my list, it's number 4.
Okay.
We'll see where it goes in later if
Sure.
you have to change it. But okay, what do you think are the other 3 in the list?
The UK has to be up there, right?
Okay, it's in number 5.
Oh, really? Okay,
It's-
so Canada's bigger. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
apparently.
interesting. United States?
Yes.
Yeah.
US is number 1 on the list. So you have 2 more countries, number 2 and number 3.
Okay.
So number
I have
3
to
I was shocked about because I thought it was UK, and it was the UK, but then now it's another country.
I have to say this just because of the proximity and the size of this country. Is China
No.
on the list?
No.
Okay.
So, I mean, 2 and 3 both are in Asia. Number 2 is where we are right now.
Oh,
I just
of
gave you-
course. UAE. Yeah.
Yeah.
Silly. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so
Yeah,
number 2 is UAE. Number 3, what do you think number 3 is? Again, Asia. It's.
Let's see.
I'm surprised that this is there.
It's not China, you said. So what would it be? Like Malaysia?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I was surprised there because I didn't think it would be top 3, to be honest. But yeah. So it's US, UAE, Malaysia, and Canada.
Wow.
Because UAE and Canada both have like some of the largest populations of Indians, I wanted to talk about how it's like being a South Asian. I'm not saying all South Asians are Indians, but South Asian or an Indian in 2 of these countries. So now we can talk a little bit about how it is in Canada.
Sure.
And what you just said, which was that 40% of Indians in Canada are Punjabis, you said?
35 to 40%.
Okay.
The numbers are rough because you're looking at like 2021 numbers and 2022 numbers, but we know that there was a lot of immigration post-COVID. So it's hard to say. So these are all rough numbers, to be clear. But it is about 2.5 million, and 35 to 40% of that are Punjabi.
Okay.
And Punjabis, in terms of the South Asian population in Canada, have a long history. So Punjabis started immigrating to Canada in the late 19th century, so late 1800s. And part of the reason was they were part of the British Indian Army. And once they had kind of done their army duty, they were dissatisfied with their pensions.
Okay.
And so they were looking for new opportunities abroad. And Canadian companies basically offered, Canadian companies that were largely, building railways or doing other activities in natural resource extraction, including a lot of fur trapping, were basically offering jobs with some security. And that started to attract a lot of immigrants, including from India. And so largely this Punjabi population started to immigrate to Canada over time, of course. In fact, 1905 was the first Gurdwara in North America.
Wow.
It was in a place called Golden, British Columbia, which is actually closer to the Alberta border.
Okay.
And then the second Gurdwara in North America, 1908, was in Vancouver itself. So, the Punjabi community has long ties and history in British Columbia particularly, but also in Ontario and throughout Canada. And we see that in the prominence of Punjabi culture being the more dominant South Asian culture throughout Canada, whether it's the cuisine, whether it's just the visibility of Sikhs as well in our culture, business owners, people in politics, tend to be largely Punjabi. Obviously, that's changing, and Hindus and Muslims as well becoming more prominent. But yeah, that's largely, in a nutshell, the sort of South Asian demographics.
But generally, how do people in Canada perceive South Asians? Like how are South Asians or South Asian identity thought about? Yeah, how are South Asians thought about in Canada?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, again, I think there is that dominance of Punjabi culture.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who it's not that they mean harm by it, but they probably amalgamate a lot of it together, right?
They think being South Asian is
all the
Punjabi.
Same. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that is changing, certainly with time, especially as more non-Punjabi South Asians become prominent and move to Canada. I think that's certainly changing. But yeah, the Punjabi culture is definitely very dominant. In terms of how South Asians are perceived, I think that they are perceived as hardworking people, and they have been in various industries, certainly becoming more entrepreneurial based as well. Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot. I mean, in some regard, Canada is also great because I don't think most Canadians necessarily think about race or whatever, right? They might think of things like how long if you're a newcomer versus not.
Oh, okay.
Maybe there's more of a division that way, but less so on racial terms.
Would they ask like, oh, where are you really from? Like those type of questions?
Yeah, that exists. But I think even that question, so much of it is intonation and subtext. Right? So some people are just genuinely curious.
True.
Where is your family from? Is that an offensive question? Not really. Like, I think people are just curious. But I would agree when you go, oh, where are you from? And I go, oh, North Vancouver. Yeah. And someone goes, no, where are you really from? Then it sounds kind of weird, right?
Yeah.
But if they were to say, oh, no, where's your family from? I wouldn't take offense to that. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I mean, I have no right to say, but for me, I think it's very, even if I guess I did have citizenship, that's just how I say it. I don't know if that would be true if I did have citizenship here in UAE. But if someone would ask me where I guess I'm from, I think I would still say Pakistan. I don't know. I don't know. That has a lot to do with, I guess, the ideology in Canada versus the UAE in terms of the separation. There is that separation, I guess, made here, which is why probably I would naturally just say Pakistan. So that's why for me personally, I wouldn't see it as an offensive question, but I do understand that for someone who's lived there, who has citizenship, and who, I do see why that could be offensive. That's what I mean. We talked about this a little bit before in the call, which is how is the Middle East perceived in Canada, or the UAE particularly, or Dubai, I guess?
I don't think it's thought about that much. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful way. I just mean it's literally on the opposite side of the world. So in terms of travelers, of course you'll get Canadian travelers that go through Dubai or go visit Dubai. But I don't think that the exposure is necessarily the same as it would be with perhaps Europe. Or Asian travelers, right? Because Dubai is literally in the middle of those two continents. When I tell people that I go to Dubai, it's automatically just like, oh, it's so luxurious and it's so amazing and high tech, and how do you like it? And obviously that part of Dubai exists, but they don't know places like Dera or, the older parts of Dubai, or the idea of like, I don't think that they realize. I mean, I was actually surprised when you said 60% as well, the large South Asian population in Dubai.
Yeah.
Because I remember I told people that. I said, oh, because I've been so many times now, I come every year, and I'm like, oh, I'm just excited to go to my favorite Indian restaurants. And they go, Indian? Why would you have that in Dubai? And I go, well, because there's a large Indian population there.
And they get surprised.
Yeah. So again, I think the They just don't know a ton about Dubai aside from what the glamour that they might see in media, right?
Okay. And if not Dubai, if I generally talk about the Middle East, like how is that perceived?
Good question. I mean, yeah, again, very similar, probably low information, just
Okay.
based on where we are in Canada. Yeah, just not a ton of knowledge,
Okay.
I think, about the different places. So they probably conflate maybe some of the more sensational news items with the entire region, as opposed to recognizing that the Middle East itself is very diverse and the culture, even the different Arab cultures are distinct from each other. So yeah, I don't blame Canadians for that. I mean, it is what it is, but I think people that know and have traveled very much understand that there's a difference.
There's a difference.
In terms of like I feel like when I think about Canadian travelers, where they like to go, and I don't have stats for this, I'm only basing this on my own perception. I feel like Egypt is high on the list. They like to go to Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
No?
No? The pyramids and
No, I
Sphinx
understand
and
there is
history.
the pyramids, but
yeah.
I just didn't think Egypt would be.
I think Egypt
one.
is up there. I think Jordan, you hear a lot about as well.
Okay, makes sense.
And then probably Dubai. Yeah. I think that's probably how they see a lot of the tourism in this
Region.
region.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are there certain like stereotypical views that they would have of like Arabs, for instance?
Sure. None that I want to repeat though.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, one of the good things about a multicultural society like Canada is that a lot of those stereotypes, they are broken down when you actually meet someone from those places. And so I think those stereotypes may not exist in the same way in like an urban Vancouver or an urban Toronto as they do in other places of Canada, where perhaps they don't have exposure to so many different people from different parts of the world.
Got it. Yeah.
And so, I say like, oh yeah, there might be these stereotypes that exist. But also I think in Canada, people know that people from around the world are just people. Yeah. And you kind of judge people individually as opposed to just like
them as a whole,
as a group or whatever, right?
Community.
And oftentimes the groups are a lot more complicated than we think. And I think that's true about any culture, as we've discussed today. It's easy to say, oh, on the surface, it looks like this, or, we have a reputation for this or that. But then when you dig into it, it's way more complicated and can't be summarized in a slogan or like a simple idea of what a culture is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think based on this conversation, it definitely feels like there's a lot of accepting and understanding in Canada. And there's, regardless of whatever your background, ethnicity may be, there is this the overall, the term that you use, sense of freedom to express what, I mean, I've never been to Canada. I can't say from my experience, but, and it's not just from you. I think a lot of Canadians that I've met share this perspective of how we are one, we are one community. We're all Canadians who also have these identities, dual identities, or have these different ethnicities or background, but we're still all one in a way, which I find very beautiful that exists. We've talked quite a lot about multiculturalism, South Asian identity, all of that. One, kind of circling back to this point that you've talked about quite a couple of times during this conversation, which was whether it is expensive to be in Canada. You said that it's getting expensive. I think that you mentioned that during...
It's expensive.
It's expensive.
It's absolutely expensive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to compare it to the UAE, and because there's this, obviously people know UAE is also expensive, but I want to understand how different it is like living in a big city like Dubai versus maybe Toronto. And maybe we won't have like the specific numbers or whatever to it. But I guess when we talk about Canada being expensive, what do you think are like the biggest categories of like biggest expenses?
Housing is number one.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
like I said, it's one of the most expensive housing markets in the world, comparable to like New York and London, but not having the kind of economy that New York and London have as cities. So I'm talking about Vancouver specifically. Toronto is not that far behind Vancouver. And even then, like Toronto is the financial capital of Canada. Vancouver does have a lot of commerce, obviously, and it's a port city, but it just, the housing is ridiculous. That becomes a huge living expense. So it's not just home ownership, which is out of reach for a lot of people, but even rents. You're paying like, upwards of 3,000 Canadian dollars to live in the city. Like it's a lot of money. And the wages just haven't grown, even in comparison to the United States. The wages have not grown by much in Canada. So that becomes where a lot of the expense is. Certainly for like your regular items, your groceries, expenses have gone up as well.
Okay.
Going out and eating out is quite expensive. Probably, I would say pretty comparable to Dubai, although Dubai's, I would say pretty comparable to what you pay in Dubai. Dubai might be a little cheaper in some places, and certainly there's places where you can get a deal in Dubai for food and that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But it's expensive to eat out. Taxes, I mean, that's one place where Dubai and UAE is very good, is low taxation. But in Canada, you get taxed on everything. We have consumption taxes, we have income taxes.
How much is income tax in Canada?
I mean, it depends on your earning.
Yeah.
But if you're a high earner, you're paying over like just above 50%.
Yeah, that's crazy.
On your top rate, right? It's a lot. And I think there was always kind of this deal, and I think people were comfortable paying that much, knowing that you get a lot of services in return. Particularly healthcare. So now you couple these two things that we've talked about of like high costs of housing and taxes, somewhat deteriorating healthcare system, and there are a lot of people fairly wondering, well, what am I paying all these taxes for? I'm very much, and I think if we did have a healthcare system that was quite functioning, if we did have other public services that were functioning to a level that people had come to expect, most people would be pretty fine with the amount of taxes that they were paying because you know that you're getting it back in terms of these other services. It's when those other things, those services start to break down that you go, why am I being taxed so much?
Is that the general like opinion in Canada right now, where they feel like they're not getting what their money is worth, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. I think that's been one of the big frustrations. And a frustration is the point that, again, it's not, the conversation in Canada is not around we need to cut taxes. The conversation is around we need better social services. We need to improve our social services.
So tax itself is not something that they dislike, I guess. It's just because they understand.
Yeah, they don't like it by any means.
I mean, like,
there is a feeling that we are overtaxed and that taxes are too high. But ultimately, I think the focus for most Canadians is just around public services and public institutions.
Okay. Yeah, because, I mean, obviously everyone knows about the taxation model in the UAE. It's quite a well-known fact that there's no income tax. There's 9% corporate tax. I'm not sure how the corporate tax is like in Canada. I think it's 30. I might have that stat. I'm not sure. But
again, it depends on how much you're earning, but
yeah. And so I definitely understand that taxation models of both countries are quite different, but as a result, the services that you get back is also different. So because we don't get taxed here, we pay for healthcare, but then you do get taxed in Canada, but you get free healthcare. Now, the actual quality of the services that you're getting back varies. Some would argue, we were talking a lot about healthcare, but if we talk about education systems, I think the education in Canada is much better than the UAE. I've studied in the UAE and it's great. I think you get everything that you technically need. You get like the baseline, but in terms of having a student life, in terms of being in an environment where you are pushed and challenged to do more, I feel like that happens more in Canada.
Are you talking about university?
Education. Yeah, universities mostly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, our university, like I said, we have world-class universities in Canada, and they're also, subsidized by the government. So you still have to pay a tuition, but in terms of what you're getting a pretty good deal as a Canadian going to Canadian university. Also, lots of opportunities for things like scholarships and even government grants and that type of thing. So those things are great to have. Again, I don't know what the K to 12 education is like here, but in Canada, obviously we have a very robust schooling system. In some areas, it has challenges, particularly where population has grown quite quickly. But generally speaking, as someone who went through public school myself, I valued that experience. I thought it was pretty good. And so, these are the expectations that I think we have. And then also just the infrastructure, expectations of infrastructure and roads and public transit. Public transit has, especially in urban areas, continues to be a big thing in Canada, as I think it is here too, right? Like you need to get people around because you almost want to encourage people to get out of their cars. Yeah. Right? Not just for the environment, but also just for things like congestion and the costs of building more roads. Yeah. So, I think there is a frustration of where a lot of the tax revenue has gone in the last few years. I think Canada, there's many examples. If we take isolated examples of perhaps government waste, I think there's been studies done on tax effectiveness in terms of tax that is collected and how it's spent, which ranks Canada lower than a lot of the other Western countries, which becomes very concerning. And so, like I said, I think the goal in Canada really for a lot of Canadians is to get services to a point where they feel like they're fully functional again. And again, it's one of those things you don't realize it until you need it. So if you are one of those people that lives and works within a 15-minute radius, you're not really thinking about a lot of the infrastructure stuff. If you're healthy, you're not thinking a lot about the healthcare stuff. If you don't have kids, you're not thinking a lot about education. So a lot of that just depends on where you are and who. But the complaints seem somewhat universal. But housing is something that affects everyone, right? Yeah. I mean,
when I was looking at housing in Canada and UAE, I thought UAE would be cheaper, but when it comes to living outside of the major city, the center of the city, it's cheaper in the UAE. But when it comes to living in the center of the city, it's cheaper in Canada. I think it depends. Like there were so many different.
Wait, it's cheaper in Canada to live inside the city?
Yeah, than inside the city in UAE, which I found surprising. Because I thought it'd be cheaper in the UAE. I thought rent was cheaper here, just generally. Again, it depends where. But honestly, there were so many different stats around this. Like I was trying to find for instance, the average income of an expat in UAE, average income of an expat in Canada to try to compare who probably earns more. So many different studies around it. I can't really find like a...
Well, and I think what becomes challenging is Canada is such a large country geographically. We're not a large country in terms of population, but geographically we're quite large. And so you have these very distinct areas. Yeah. So almost a more fair comparison would be just to compare like Dubai and Vancouver and look at those numbers. That makes sense. But again, Dubai is also like a very central financial hub. And Vancouver, while it is, has its commercial base, I don't know if it's comparable. Like it's not, they're two very different cities, right? For many reasons that we just discussed. But, does Vancouver bring in the same type of investment that Dubai does? I don't think so.
Yeah. But then in that case, that means we can't really compare any city in that?
Sort of. I mean, Yes and no. You would compare based on comparable size.
Certain factors that
Certain
needs to
factors.
be.
Yeah. It's understanding the differences.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Makes sense. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, you can compare any cities, but then just knowing that, like, okay, but keep in mind, these are two different cities. So,
Okay. Awesome. So I kind of want to conclude by talking a little bit about the entrepreneurship side of things and how that's like in Canada. Obviously, when we think of US, we think of like the startup scene in the US. We think of SF, Silicon Valley, all of that. How is that like? How is the startup scene like in Canada?
From my understanding, we don't have the same base of like angel investors and that angel investor network that the United States has in certain cities. I think the entrepreneurial spirit in Vancouver definitely exists. You think about a lot of global companies that have come out of Vancouver, whether that's Hootsuite or Lululemon. So yes,
I didn't know Lululemon.
Oh yeah,
Canadian.
yeah.
Okay.
So the entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurs very much exist in Vancouver and have for a long time. You think about the connections that Vancouver has with Hong Kong and just with East Asia in general as well. We're also Vancouver in particular and British Columbia, the province that we're in, has much more export diversification than the rest of Canada as well. You know, Vancouver's a big port, the biggest port in Canada. So looking outward in terms of doing business with other countries around the world, as I myself am personally involved in, you know, defines a lot of the commerce in Vancouver. It is, again, and I know I might sound like a broken record, but the cost of housing also extends to the cost of, based on the cost of land, which also then affects things like office space or industrial space. And so for entrepreneurs, including particularly those who want to do anything with regard to manufacturing or something that requires industrial space, very high barrier to entry. Very difficult to kind of get your business off the ground. Even office space itself, very expensive. So we see, unfortunately, a lot of migration to the United States for those type of things, where I think is way more, and you can talk to either corporate lawyers or accountants, way more business friendly than Canada is. And that's something that Canada is reckoning with. We have, you know, quite a stagnant economic productivity compared to other G7 or Western countries, which is very much to our detriment because we have the talent, we have the resources, we have the connectivity with other places in the world, but we just don't seem to have the business environment that's conducive for entrepreneurship. And so you see a lot of talent, you know, going to places like San Francisco, going to places even some smaller states in the United States, depending on their business. And it's not just people, it's then capital that then goes in and invests more in the United States. So this is becoming a problem, and we're currently going through, as of recording, we're going through a federal election, and this is going to be one of those issues for the business community as well. In terms of what Canada can do to make it easier for entrepreneurs, to make it easier for business people, and to really encourage the development of these newer industries. I think Vancouver is somewhat ahead of the curve because we do have a pretty decent tech sector, but it is something that is fragile and that needs to be cultivated in order to grow.
Definitely COVID, like even private sector, this crazy dip, and then the self-employed sector just kind of went down and didn't pick up.
But private sector employment growth is very slow, for sure. Yeah, that's definitely an issue in Canada.
Yeah. Because even when I was I was trying to understand if when we think of like startups, businesses, we don't always think of Canada. And that's not to say there's not cool, you know, big startups that have come out of Canada. It's just to say that you don't always think of Canada. And I was trying to see if that's because, is there less of an entrepreneurial culture within Canada?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think often actually what happens is, I mean, and so I mentioned tech, but even biotech, like we do have these industries on the cutting edge of, you know, you call it high tech or places where angel investors like to put their money.
Yeah.
But what happens is they often get to a certain size and then realize like, oh, it's much more profitable to move to the United States.
Yeah, makes sense.
And so that happens a lot.
Okay.
And again, so you have that where companies get to a certain size and then feel like it's better to migrate. And then now I would say increasingly so, it's just harder for entrepreneurs to actually get off the ground. Plus, as I've said, that network of like angel investors doesn't exist. One thing to keep in mind that has kept Silicon Valley in particular so fruitful is not just having the institutions, but the thickness between institutions. And so what I mean by that is you have kind of research facilities and universities, you have angel investors, you have private companies, and they all kind of intertwine and work together. It's like this ecosystem that is that lends itself to innovation.
True.
Whereas in Canada, we don't really have that type of thicknesses created between institutions. It does exist, but not to the same level that you see in certain places in the United States.
Yeah, what you just said about how people usually, I guess, migrate or take their startup to the US, I think that happens quite a lot with other immigrant founders. I was looking at what are the there was this study recently, I think it was last year, that looked into the unicorns that came out of the US, and almost 50% of the founders of those unicorns were immigrant founders.
Right.
And the number one country that they came from was India.
Right.
And that study also showed that if you take your startup from India to the US, you're 6.5 times more likely to succeed. And that was, I guess it's not surprising. I would understand like the infrastructure, the facilities there is kind of crazy. I was trying to find something like that in the UAE. If there's a study like that, there isn't much yet. I hope there would be. So we can kind of compare that to how the startup scene is like here in the UAE. I know that opening up a business here is very, very easy. There's lots of different institutions, infrastructure that help you in starting up a business. I think that's quite simple. There's literally a place where you can go and register your license. It's called it's a cafe. It's called DED Cafe. So it's literally a cafe where you just go and you can grab a bite and go and register your company.
Oh, cool.
Which is cool. And I think when I mean, for me, I would consider this my company and it's registered. So it's different for different types of companies. But for me, it took like, I think an hour to get it registered, which again I was surprised about how fast it is here. But yeah, there's no particular stats about how, I guess, more likely you are to succeed if you move to a country like the UAE when it comes to your business or startup, which I hope there would be more stats and studies around so we could compare. But yeah, that's...
It probably depends on the business too, right? And, a tech startup is far different than like a brick and mortar retail space.
You're right, yeah.
So all of that stuff, I think, plays a role for sure. I think, going back to what you were saying about, the unicorns that were created and they're created by immigrants. I mean, that's the immigrant mentality. That's what they're immigrating for, is to be able to work in a place that avails opportunities that they didn't have in their home country.
100%.
And that's also, with the same token, explains Canadian migration of talent or entrepreneurs to the United States, or businesses of just trying to avail not just a larger market, but just opportunities to grow that don't exist at home.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that is one of like the main reasons you would even consider migrating. Like it's literally to get better opportunities. So that makes total sense. That's exactly it. Yeah.
You're not moving for the weather. Like the weather might be nice, but it's like very hard to leave your home
for that. Yeah.
Just for that.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that makes complete sense. Okay, awesome. So we've covered quite a lot.
So much. I hope this wasn't boring.
No, this was great. I hope you weren't bored.
No, I had a good time.
I hope you enjoyed it. So just to end, I guess, conclude this long conversation on how it's like living in Canada, how it's like living in UAE, and we touched on US as well. Again, this is not a yes or no question, but just based on everything that we talked about, if I had to ask you, is it nice to live in Canada? How would you, or actually, is it better to live in Canada than the UAE? You don't have to say yes or no, but I just want, how would you feel about a question like that? Yeah.
They're different places. I don't like the framing of one is better than the other because I don't think it's fair. And I'm not in a position to even make that judgment because I haven't done both as an adult.
Makes sense.
I think that Canada is the best place in the world to live. I'm very fortunate. And I'm very fortunate that my parents immigrated to Canada at the time that they did. I understand that the challenges are much different now for new immigrants to Canada. But I think at the time that we did, the era in which I grew up, it was an amazing place to be. Okay. And it still is. We have our challenges, but I still think it's one of the world's best countries. That said, a place like Dubai, which, is so innovative, has, an incredible business culture here. Public safety is paramount here. It's so safe and clean. Would also be a great place to live. Like, I don't think there's any denying that either. So I cringe at the question of what's better or worse because it's hard for me to compare. I can understand why people would choose either. I think there are fundamental differences between the two countries, and they're just differences. Mm-hmm. It's not better or worse. But that said, as a Canadian, obviously I'm going to say that Canada is the best place to live. And if you have ambition and, want to live in a place that I think treats people well and has a great wants to build a strong social safety net, a multicultural environment as well, where you can really set roots, I think Canada should be your number one choice. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. One thing I remember that I didn't bring up in the conversation, I just want to conclude with this and get your perspective on this very quickly, was I was watching this video about a Canadian who moved from Canada to the UAE, and he was talking about his experience in Canada, in the UAE. I'm going to use his words, the way he describes how it's like living in Canada versus how it's like living in the UAE. And what he said was, living in UAE is like you are a customer, and living in Canada is like you are an employee. And I will explain that. Okay. Again, this was that perspective, but I was just curious to see what you think of it. What he said was, living in UAE is like you get treated as a customer because everything is built with the idea that you are serving a customer, that this person is coming to your country and you are trying to give them these facilities. So you're building everything with the intention that the customer is always right. The everything with the idea of that you have a customer.
Sure.
At the same time, that usually in businesses, the customer does not contribute directly to how the product is built, right? So that's the same here. We don't vote, for instance. We don't have voting here. Right. We don't directly contribute to the laws that are passed here. So that's what he said. Whereas in Canada, why he said employee was because, one, an employee of a business is someone who is directly contributing to whatever it is that the company builds, whatever products that they're building. So that's literally what people in Canada do. They're voting. Why in the other perspective, why employee was because there is this expectation that the person needs to contribute. There's like a resource that's being extracted from the person, and that's why there's this idea of an employee mentality. So that was his perspective, which I found interesting. I cannot comment on Canada's, and maybe you can't comment on UAE's, but if I had to comment on UAE's particularly, I agree with that. I definitely think living in UAE is like I'm a customer of a business, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I will say about UAE, the service here is incredible. It's one of the best places in terms of just service anywhere you go. It's really top notch here. For Canada, I don't know if I would call it employee. I would call it like a shareholder in a sense, okay. Right? So I do think that we all have a stake, certainly, and obviously our participation in democracy is part of that as well. So I would make it more akin to like being a shareholder in the country, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
probably a fair assessment in terms of how you've described it otherwise. Like, I think that does make sense. And Dubai is also very good at attracting talent, right? So I know that, I don't know if this program still exists, but I remember hearing about what you would pay and what kind of benefits you would give nurses from abroad coming into Dubai.
Okay.
Right? So being able to attract talent to the region, I think, speaks to that idea of like attracting customers. And so perhaps there is something that Canada could learn, especially if we're trying to fill certain gaps of labor and workers that we need. But again, I think the promise of Canada, and this is not speaking to, again, any other nation, but the promise of Canada is that, yeah, you can come here and become a shareholder in the company, right? And I think that for a lot of people, that's very appealing.
Yeah.
But for some people, if service is king, then maybe other places are more appealing. So it depends. It depends on what you're looking for. It depends on what your lifestyle is. And it depends how you see your future as well.
Yeah.
And that's going to vary with each person.
Yeah. It kind of depends on whether you want to be a customer or a shareholder.
Yeah.
If we had to kind of conclude it in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say is if you want to buy, this is completely unrelated, but speaking of customers, if you want to buy designer goods or like name brand things, Canada's cheaper.
Oh,
than Dubai,
really?
for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Even when you factor in taxes, Canada is still cheaper. I don't know why, but what I will say, the availability of especially high-end luxury, way more available in Dubai for sure. Mm-hmm. But like whether it's, certain handbags or luxury watches or even things like Apple or whatever, I've looked at prices and I'm pretty sure Canada is cheaper.
But do you think it depends on the brand? Like, I think if a brand is by a country that's
we might. But what I'm saying is we might not have certain brands. Because you have everything here. You have all the brands here. Mm-hmm. Vancouver in particular is getting better. Like I think they just opened like a Balenciaga boutique as well, which we didn't have before. But we have a lot of the same brands, and it's even with taxes cheaper.
Wow, I don't know why though.
Well,
the import cost. I don't know.
I don't know. That's actually something worth looking into.
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's interesting.
Might have to do with currency exchange as well.
Could be.
But yeah, because I thought that here, because of the low taxes, it would be cheap. But it would be cheap. But I think they make up for it, and I think brands, especially at that level, are hyper aware of cost differentials. Yeah. So they try to even everything out.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting. That's something we could look into to see like why that.
Dubai probably also caters to a lot of travelers or just people in transit. And so they may be coming from countries that don't have access to those brands. So they're willing to pay a slight premium to buy them.
True.
Whereas I think in Canada, sure, we do have tourists that buy those brands, but we also have a lot of locals that buy those brands. So
I remember when I went to the US, I checked for brands and if it would be cheaper, and it was around the same price, so I didn't buy anything from there. But I did think initially that in the US it was cheaper. Maybe in Canada it's cheaper than, I don't know. But yeah, that's interesting.
Depends on what it is, but yeah, I feel like in the US the US and Canada would be very similar prices.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you. This was so fun.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate the invitation.
Honestly, I enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It was such a great conversation. We usually end by doing a cheers. Would you want to do that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Cheers.
Cheers.